Hello and welcome to the Certified CyberCop Cybersecurity Engineer course, CCSE. This is going to be the introductory module for the CCSE certification. In this course, we'll be talking about what it takes to be a cybersecurity engineer, including concepts, fundamentals, many more topics. First module will be an introduction to the program itself and the CCSE certification. So module 1. So this is our agenda. We'll discuss the market need for certified cybersecurity engineers and why they're important. It is a critical time in our society where everything is connected to everything else. So the market is only growing and doesn't seem to be slowing down anytime soon. So we're going to talk about the company. We'll introduce the course. We'll go over the exam details. We'll also look at recommended experience level, audience, prerequisites, and we'll talk about each of the individual course topics and also go over some best practices for the course. So let's first talk about the market. So the global cybersecurity market is rapidly growing, going from $120 billion in 2017 to $300 billion by 2024. Cybersecurity products and services will be $1 trillion. They've grown over $1 trillion in total value 2017 to 2021. And there are 3.5 million roughly unfilled jobs in cybersecurity globally. And that is a crying shame because of the fact that there are so many opportunities out there for certifications, but it's difficult to know what certifications are out there. So cybersecurity positions have grown 350% since 2013. Some of you may remember the Edward Snowden leaks around 2013, 2014, which changed the game in many ways for how intelligence is gathered and revealed the fact that the U.S. federal government was collecting information on its various users, citizens, and so on and so forth. So it's a critical time more than ever to be engaged in the cybersecurity market and also bring as many people into the fold as possible. So that's what we aim to do here. So let's talk about the market as far as the size. So this is kind of the chart that shows the difference in professional services versus managed services. You might have heard the term managed service provider, or MSP, and there's managed security service provider, especially with things like the cloud and big data and Internet of Things, all driving the train to increase the amount of revenue and also the money that has to be spent on cybersecurity as a whole. Even the United States federal government has passed recently legislation to increase the focus on cybersecurity, provide more relevant training, and so on and so forth. Let's talk about first our company. So our company, CertCop, is a cybersecurity training division of SecBay Incorporated. We are a U.S.-based company. Our team members have an average information technology experience of 20 plus years. The trainers, well known for putting students first, and as we say many times in the class, we stay with you until you get certified. That is in stark contrast to many of the other certification companies out there. Trainers understand specific challenges of cybersecurity training amongst government clients, veterans, and well as veteran issues, including the VA, post-traumatic stress disorder, combat stress. CertCop is a force multiplier for companies. CertCop instructors understand the unique challenges veterans and government contractors and government employees alike face. We have over a 95% pass rate for those that follow our model. The other 5% come back for a special review session or exam prep Q&A or take the course again and they eventually pass the certification. So if you follow our course model, work hard, you will be successful. It is a no-fail if you put the work in. So let's talk about the course as a whole. We're going to talk about the number of questions on the exam, how long the exam is, what kind of training methods can you expect. We'll talk about what you're going to get as far as deliverables as well. So really this course is for anybody who has an interest in security professionals, networking background, anything, might be practicing some of these techniques at home on your home networks, but always do things with permission, do things ethically, whether you're an offensive or a defensive practitioner. So on the next slide, you'll see the specialized topics we're going to cover in this course. So there are 21 modules, and we will cover these topics as well as subtopics. Keep in mind, these are not all encompassing for everything you need to know in cybersecurity, but we believe this is the best combination of materials for you to be successful in this course and also walk away with a well-rounded security program. So this will not only help you be better as a security professional or IT professional, but it will also help you do things like design security awareness programs and so on and so forth. So we'll talk about the certification, cybersecurity fundamentals. We'll continue with network fundamentals design because we want your network fundamentals to be strong. We will look at security architectures, identity management, privileged access, access control. We'll talk about some of the data protection laws, the new GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. We'll talk about network design. We'll talk about how the more effectively designed networks and how modern networks are designed, especially in the cloud. So that rolls us into the topic of cloud security. The cloud is really just virtualization with other people's hardware. You'll hear me say that again and again in the course. And then, of course, penetration testing, because if you don't do pen testing, then you really don't have security, or you don't have a comfort level that your organization is going to be secure when the bad guys try to probe your network. So we'll talk about compliance, of course, governance, risk, and compliance, or the GRC committee, as it sometimes is called. We'll go over open source intelligence. We'll get into ways to gather information online freely. Many of these open source intelligence tools are 100% free and open source. There are proprietary intelligence sources which you might use during a reconnaissance phase of a red team or a blue team if you're trying to think like the bad guys and figure out what is actually on your network or what is out there, what is exposed, and what's your attack surface look like. So open source intelligence will give you a lot of information on that. We'll talk about risk analysis, risk management. We'll go over security assessments as well as auditing. We'll talk about application development, secure application development, because some studies have said that over 70% of the vulnerabilities now come from the application layer. So it's critical more than ever that we have trained developers that are able to write secure code and do that effectively. So, of course, we'll talk about biometrics, the something you are model of the multi-factor authentication. We'll talk about how biometrics works as far as identification. Not only can it uniquely identify you, but can also authenticate you, and is highly secured, and if done properly, it will be an incredible asset to securing the organization. Another layer in the defense in depth. Then we have cryptography. Cryptography, of course, otherwise known as the study of encryption. Encryption is constantly changing. New attacks from side channel attacks are coming out, and so there are many different things that to be aware of with that. We'll talk about working from home, machine learning, blockchain, and of course, IP addressing. So, what is a certified cybersecurity engineer? What do they do? That's a question that many students have asked me over the years. What exactly do you need to do? Because it's difficult to know. The idea behind this is that this engineer course is designed to give you a foundational look at today's cybersecurity landscape and give you the tools to evaluate and manage security protocols in information systems. Now, that does not mean that you will be an expert in all the tools upon completion of this course. It will provide you the foundation, and you will become a subject matter expert later as you continue to learn and continue to grow. So we'll talk about also, so a cybersecurity professional or cybersecurity engineer is a professional who creates and executes secure network solutions that provide security against cyber attacks, hackers. They also regularly monitor and test systems to ensure systems are updated and functioning well. According to Indeed.com, security engineer, similar job opening, 2,838 job openings, averaging a salary of $103,956 per year. An IT security specialist, over 1,320 job openings, $79,824 per year. Security systems engineer, 654 job openings, over $104,000 per year. Network security engineer, 628 job openings at $111,000 per year. There's also a cloud engineer as well as application security engineer, which comes out just over $126,000 per year. So there are many different titles that a cybersecurity engineer can go by. It does not limit you to one particular area. Again, of course, you can always specialize if there's an area that interests you. So let's talk now about the exam. So the exam is 100 questions and 3 hours. So therefore, that means roughly about 1.5 minutes per question. So what does that mean? You can't spend too much time on any one question. If you spend too much time, it's likely you will not complete the exam and not be successful. You want to at least answer every question, and keep in mind that you might find an answer to a question you're struggling with in a future question. So just skip that question, mark it, and move on. You can always come back and adjust your answer later. Though there will be some memorization as far as acronyms, protocols, port numbers. Those are things that cannot be helped because you may not be able to answer the question if you don't know what the acronym stands for. There's also the case where they may ask you to prove a negative. They ask you to prove something. They'll say, which one of the following is not one of whatever the case may be. So you want to pay attention to keywords when you're going through the exam. So what are our training methods? We've got website, virtual training. We've got virtual live training, instructor-led training, as well as classroom and on-site training. So the virtual live training is designed using cutting-edge learning management systems, or LMSs, in combination with interactive virtual classrooms. This offers flexibility of learning from a live instructor without incurring any of the travel expenses. Participants in virtual live training will receive required materials by mail and should allow enough time for delivery. And this is available with most of the courses offered at CertFirst. So, which requires labs. We will require access to remote or virtual labs. And of course, these are at no additional cost to you, something that not many, if any, other organization training providers offer. And the current specials are listed on our website. We do various promotions, including free Kindle Fire with electronic courseware, or possibly an iPad or something when purchasing a more 5-day course. But always check the website for the most up-to-date. This does not apply with any group training discounted programs. Government clients getting special discounted prices also may not qualify for the above specials because they're already getting massive discount. There is also, we're very proud of the self-study option. So the self-study option is one of the best in the industry. All of our self-study programs are unique and are integrated packages to make sure the candidate should be able to prepare themselves for exams, as well as gain important knowledge to be effective at the workplace. They include all the required courseware, online exam prep tools, trainer tips for the exams or cert tips, simulation tools for many programs, as well as post-assessment tools. We also offer online learning tools for many of our self-study programs through our partners to provide you with the best possible self-study package. Great way to get certified for busy professionals who can't find time to travel to a training center and want to study at their own convenience. Now, what about classroom training? So, classroom training, instructor-led, hands-on for the latest and most sought-after professional certification programs at all locations throughout the USA, Canada, Europe, and Asia. Our CertCop programs, we have developed programs for both experienced professionals who want to get certified in their specialized area, but may not want to spend too much time in the class. During COVID-19, most clients preferred not to travel, so this provides an excellent option for all candidates to experience the same instructor-led, hands-on training, virtual live on Cisco WebEx platform. So keep in mind, we also offer micro courses on the CertCop website. Micro courses are designed to give you little bite-sized nuggets of training so you can advance your skill set, update your skills, or learn maybe something new without taking a full-on certification. Let's talk about the course materials. So the course materials you're going to get, all the course materials you're needed to be able to effectively navigate this course. Also, will include any handouts, cert tips, as well as the certification exam prep tools, practice questions, flashcards. We also offer a mock exam that will be part of the preparation before taking the real exam. That's for the virtual live training. The flashcards you can find on the CertCop website will also provide with the exam voucher if that is purchased as part of the package. So talk to your sales rep or management for the latest and greatest information. So who is the target audience? What type of jobs will this program target? We've already kind of touched on it a little bit, but so you can see various C-level executives, CISOs, CIOs, IT directors. So it's good for not only managers, but also technical individuals as well. So security systems engineers, analysts, architect, security auditor, security consultant. So there are many different titles across the spectrum. Although anybody that is responsible for security, whether it's physical security, technical security, or administrative security actions, can benefit from this course. So this is a 40-hour course. Upon completion, you will receive a course completion certificate. So additionally, you can use that certificate to apply to maintain other certifications like CompTIA or ISC2 and EC Council. You can also use this to maintain your DoD 8570 cybersecurity workforce requirements, or DoD 8140 if it is officially changed over by the time of this recording. It may be. Any past experience in networking and security background will be beneficial to you as you navigate this course. So let's talk about best practices. So number one, there is absolutely no substitute for hard work. There's no magic pill. There's no silver bullet. There's no special sauce that you can utilize to bypass the effort you're going to have to put in by navigating this course. There's going to be a lot of complex topics. Some topics will be heavily dependent on your ability to remember things like acronyms, basics of networking, port numbers, etc. Make sure you use all the tools at your disposal. Google is your friend. No one could be an expert in all areas, and because things are always changing, the latest and greatest guidance may be only a search away. So ask an instructor or send an email to support@certverse.com for additional information. So consult your reference material if you're confused. Of course, the more repetition you do with acronyms and port numbers and these concepts, the better you'll get at it. As I say, no one could be an expert. And again, Google or any kind of search, DuckDuckGo. Google, of course, tends to have better search results, but we're going to show you how to do open source intelligence. We'll look at how to use what they call Google dorking to find things very quickly online. So not only will you learn the skills to be a certified CyberCop in this course, but you'll also learn skills to help you just be a better student. So, and of course, most importantly, have fun. So, Cybersecurity Engineer program is designed to give you a foundational look at today's cybersecurity landscape, provide you with the tools to manage protocols and information systems. So, of course, a cybersecurity engineer, the definition is a professional who creates and executes network security solutions and has the ability to monitor and troubleshoot systems to ensure they are operating securely and efficiently. One saying I had in the military for system engineering or any kind of cybersecurity engineering was install, operate, and maintain. So we're going to show you how to not only install the tools, operate them, but also maintain and update the tools so you can be assured that you're not adding to the attack surface by having out-of-date tools. So not only do you have to patch your systems and harden your systems, but you also have to update your tools as well. So these are the specialized topics. We've seen these already. So topic number 2, cybersecurity fundamentals. What are you going to learn? So we're going to start out with the CIA triad. Critical concept that you must understand at a minimum. Because without the CIA triad, everything goes back to the CIA triad. We're going to talk about identification, authorization, accounting. We're going to talk about other standards like NIST, cybersecurity framework. We'll look at threat modeling like OWASP. We'll talk about non-repudiation. You might hear the acronym AAA. You have authorization, authentication, and accounting. Auditing and accounting are sometimes used interchangeably, but depends on your organization. So these principles used to be called information assurance. Now everything is just called cybersecurity. So we're trying to build upon concepts and principle upon principle. It's a marathon, not a sprint. So keep that in mind. So we'll cover the basics of confidentiality, integrity, availability. We'll talk about how they relate to cybersecurity as a whole. So once on the skills you need to be able to perform as an effective certified cybersecurity engineer is to be able to explain security risks and vulnerabilities and how they relate in terms to the CIA triad. So for example, talking about confidentiality, encryption, we have integrity, which is provided by hashing, and availability. And finally, identity and access management. So identity and access management is a critical part. We'll talk about the AAA protocols. We'll talk about defense in depth, layered security. Again, the more layers you can put on in between you and the bad guys, the better. So topic 3, network fundamentals design. We're going to talk about networking. We're going to talk about OSI model, TCP/IP model, transport layer protocols. We're going to talk about port numbers. We'll look at some packet sniffers like Wireshark and TCP dump. We'll talk about classful IP addressing. You have to understand some things like about TCP and UDP. We'll talk about common networking protocols that you will see on enterprise networks. We're also going to talk about DNS, domain name system. We're going to talk about different types of DNS records. So you have to understand how those all fit together. We're going to talk about DNS poisoning, attacks of changing DNS to redirect someone to a different location. We're going to talk about session hijacking. In many ways, session hijacking can be done. We'll talk about wireless networking. We'll look at some secure network components and building blocks like IDSs, IPSs. We'll talk about cabling and also network topologies. So more additional topics. You have secure networks protocols, secure voice communications. We'll talk about multimedia, email security, remote access, virtual private networking, as well as virtualization, of course, beneficial topic for the cloud. You cannot do the cloud without virtualization. We'll talk about network address translation, or NAT. We'll look at switching and WAN, so from wide area networking, how those apply. We'll talk about different security boundaries like DMZ, and we'll even get into some zero trust architecture. We'll talk about how to mitigate or prevent attacks. So next topic, security architecture. What are you going to learn? We're going to look at managing engineering processes. We're going to look at secure design principles. So we're going to cover the underlying security concerns by conducting a brief survey of the field known as computer architecture. So we'll look at major components of a computing system, hardware, firmware. From a security perspective, we'll look at more detailed analysis is not always a luxury available to you because of resource and time constraints. So we're going to talk about that as well. Security professionals should have at least a basic understanding of these concepts in case they encounter an incident that reaches down to the system design level. And we'll look at ways to mitigate security vulnerabilities as well as the client server model, databases, Internet of Things, and industrial control systems, and also SCADA devices. So we'll talk about how to mitigate vulnerabilities in web-based systems. We'll talk about some of the different web application threats. We'll look at vulnerabilities in mobile. We'll also touch on embedded systems like the Raspberry Pi, medical devices, system on a chip, and of course, real-time operating systems. We'll talk about essential security protection mechanisms and common architecture flaws and security issues. Topic 5, identity management. So let's talk about topic 5, identity management, privileged access management, and identity and access management. Now, there are three very similar acronyms, but they are separate things, separate processes, or they should be for the organization. It's critical to understand the nuances of them because they may vary from operating system to operating system and device to device. So let's talk about, first we'll talk about controlling access to assets. We'll talk about asset management. We'll talk about identification versus authentication. We'll look at different ways identity management has been implemented. We'll talk about the identity and access provisioning lifecycle. Provisioning meaning where we create the accounts. We'll talk about remote access management. So whether it's secure shell, remote desktop protocol, whatever it is, we will cover that. VPNs, virtual private networks. So again, many individuals may or may not be aware that your internet service provider does track pretty much everything you do. So only one of the ways to protect against that is through a VPN. On the enterprise level, many companies use VPNs to provide additional layer of security and encryption for their users that are connecting and working remotely. So then we have, of course, we'll talk about some of the different information systems capabilities. So it's important to understand the limits of your system so you can effectively manage them. So topic 6, access control. Access control is a fundamental component of data security that will dictate who's allowed to access and use company information and resources. Through authentication and authorization, access control policies make sure users are who they say they are and that they have the appropriate access rights to company data. So we're going to look at some of the different access control models, like the role-based access control, mandatory access control. We'll talk about discretionary access control, as is common with Windows. We will talk about permissions, rights, privileges, and the differences between those permissions, rights, and privileges in Linux versus Windows. We'll talk about the implicit deny. We'll look at access control matrices and constrained interfaces. One example of a constrained interface is a ATM. We'll talk about how that interface is limited for security reasons. We'll look at content and context dependent control. And we'll talk about, of course, the principle of least privilege, good policies to have in place, separation of duties, and, of course, defense in depth. So these are our models of access control we're going to talk about. We'll talk about discretionary access control, which requires if someone has access, then they can give somebody else access. We'll talk about role-based access control, assigning permissions based on the position or job of the individual. We'll talk about attribute-based access control, which is becoming more popular and more common in the cloud. Of course, we'll look at mandatory access control, example of being SE Linux or SE Android. We'll talk about different hierarchical environments. We'll talk about a compartmentalized environment as well as versus hybrid. So we'll talk about different access control attacks. We'll look at brute force attacks for passwords. We'll talk about dictionary attacks and some of the tools that are included with Kali Linux and Parrot Linux. We'll look at rainbow table attacks. Rainbow table attacks being essentially avoiding the compute time that's needed to process a hash of passwords. We'll look at different statistical anomalies like the birthday paradox and birthday attacks that allow us to potentially find collisions in some otherwise insecure or otherwise secure hash functions. We'll look at key stretching techniques like PBK DF2, password-based key derivation function number 2, as well as bcrypt. And we'll look at password sniffing attacks and, of course, spoofing, whether it's by IP address, MAC address, or by phone number, mobile. We'll get into phishing, and its counterpart, spear phishing. Looking for high-level targets, we'll talk about whaling, vishing, voice solicitation via cell phone. We'll talk about smishing, unwanted text messages, and of course, smart card attacks. Smart cards are popular because of the security benefits they provide, but they have to be done and implemented securely and updated correctly as well. Let's talk about topic 7, data protection. So data protection, data is the lifeblood of any organization. If you don't have data, you don't have an organization. So we'll talk about data in transit. We'll talk about data at rest, data in use. We'll look at some data retention policies. What are the requirements, both nationally and internationally? We'll talk about data destruction, different types of backups. Look at degaussing or purging, wiping disks versus overwriting. We'll talk about some of the different tools for that. We'll look at shredding documents, also called pulping, degaussing for the HDDs or hard disk drives. We'll talk about acceptable use policies, generally signed by users when they first get to an organization, and then hopefully annually thereafter. We'll look at the clean desk policy, separation of duties again, data breach response, and of course, disaster recovery. You might hear it called continuity of operations or contingency operations, but either way, organizations must have a solid disaster recovery and business continuity plan. Let's talk about topic 8, network design. So in this module, we're going to talk about switching. Building blocks. These are going to be our basic building blocks of networking. So switching, routing, what is the difference between switches and routers? What about routing protocols? How do routing protocols work? We'll talk about firewalls, IDSs, IPSs, or as NIST sometimes calls it, IDPS, Intrusion Detection Prevention System. We'll talk about spanning tree protocol, IEEE standard 802.1d. We'll talk about QoS, or quality of service. We'll look into wireless, as well as voice over IP and next-gen firewalls and unified threat monitoring devices. Also, I call them the everything in the kitchen sink device because it has nearly everything in one. Now let's talk about a very important topic near and dear to my heart, cloud security. Because the cloud security is somewhat of an oxymoron because in many cases you may have no control over the security, unfortunately. So we're going to talk about some different characteristics of cloud. We're going to talk about cloud models. We'll look at the public cloud versus private. We'll talk about the hybrid cloud. If you have similar organizations with similar requirements, you might be using a community cloud. We'll talk about different cloud service models, software as a service, platform as a service, and infrastructure as a service. We'll also look at virtualization, again, in the cloud, how it applies, and even security as a service, which some have said that it is a subset of software as a service. So we'll talk about the different platforms, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, AWS. We'll look at some other cloud providers and even serverless computing. So if you don't want to buy a whole virtual machine or a whole server, you can do that. So now we're going to talk about penetration testing. Penetration testing module is also known as red teaming, or potentially exploiting networks vulnerabilities, of course, with permission. So we're going to look at vulnerability scanning from the perspective of the attacker versus an insider. We'll look at footprinting, operating systems, switches, firewalls, etc. We'll also do some network discovery. So network discovery, figuring out how to enumerate systems. We'll look at port scanning with Nmap and some other tools, bypassing the firewall through techniques like firewalking. We'll look at exploit frameworks like Metasploit and Metasploitable, the exploitable VM that you can practice the various tools with. We'll talk about application layer attacks. Layer 7, we'll talk about establishing a foothold, how to move laterally, elevate privileges, exfiltrate data, and cover your tracks. To get you in the mindset of the attack team. So first and foremost must be determine the scope. There will be systems that will be out of play, which means that they're not authorized to be touched, as in they can't be scanned or exploited. Or so you'll have different color teams. You've got red team, blue team, purple team. Red team is the offensive side. Blue team are the defenders. So this course lends itself very well to both red and blue team. We do have some purple team information as well. We'll talk about black hat versus white hat versus gray hat. We'll look at black box testing, white box, and gray box testing to round it out. And then finally, command and control, or C2. And we have compliance. So compliance, of course, governance, risk, compliance tend to go together. So that's why they're both in the front here. We'll talk about strategic plan versus tactical plan, operational plans. We'll go over different standards. We'll talk about change control or change management, CM. We'll talk about different security standards, baselines like 800-53 or 800-61, information security risk monitoring guide. We'll talk about other standards like the STRIDE model, which stands for spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. So those are basically some of the different attacks. Then we have the PASTA model, and we'll talk about supply chain management. So we'll go over NIST standards, ISIL, COBIT, ITIL standards. We'll talk about SABSA. So we'll look at the risk management framework, Sarbanes-Oxley, and also the payment card industry data security standard, or PCI DSS. Let's talk about open source intelligence. Source intelligence is a pretty important topic. We're going to talk about what is open source intelligence, how it's utilized, offensive techniques. We're going to talk about different steps for creating an OSN strategy. We're going to look at some tools. We're going to look at the cycle of gathering open source intelligence. We're also going to look at how to harvest web data, particularly dark web data and others. We'll look at some of the tools and resources, and we'll look at data collection on the dark web. Topic 13, risk analysis. We're going to talk about risk management, different threats, man-made, internal, external. Life is pretty much about continuously monitoring risk and managing risk in the security world. We'll talk about different exploits. We'll look at quantitative risk management, qualitative, two different approaches to doing a similar thing. We'll talk about risk registers. We'll look at the spreadsheet of sorts by which you'll capture all of your risks and all of your organization and who's responsible for what. You'll talk about supply chain management. We'll look at some different ways to manage stakeholders, of course, to achieve the objective. We'll look at risk avoidance, mitigation, and acceptance. Of course, avoidance, we'll talk about either shutting down services that are non-essential. We'll look at risk outsourcing, which is a bit like purchasing insurance. You're transferring the risk to some other organization. We'll look at resiliency, backups, etc. We'll look at the annual loss expectancy, which equals the single loss expectancy times the annual rate of occurrence. We'll look at malicious human threats, accidental, environmental. We'll talk about threat assessments. We'll look at vulnerabilities as they apply to risk analysis, lack of malware, updated antivirus definitions, or default configurations. We'll also talk about misconfigured firewalls or just completely lacking firewalls. Topic 14, security assessments and audits. We'll talk about different audit frameworks, assessments, security audit versus security assessment. We'll talk about password audits, compliance, an information system audit. We'll look at internal, external, and physical security, as well as information governance audits. We'll talk about some of the different checklists for those audits. We'll look at virtual versus physical assessments. So we'll talk about the STRIDE model, spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. We'll talk about the DREAD model, the damage, the reproducibility, the exploitability, the applicability of particular exploits. We'll talk about PASTA, which is another model for doing threat assessments. Topic 15, we'll talk about secure application management. We'll get into software development. It's vital that developers know how to create secure code. So we have to talk about different development environments, testing environments, staging, production. We'll talk about quality assurance, provisioning, deprovisioning. We'll even look at integrity measurements. We'll talk about secure coding, best practices from OWASP and other organizations like that. We'll talk about stored procedures, obfuscation, code reuse, dead code. We'll talk about server side versus client side. We'll get into execution and validation of code. We'll talk about memory management and some of the different programming languages that do it better than others. We'll talk about third-party libraries and software development kits. And finally, data exposure. Of course, when data leaks out of applications, it's usually front page news. So there you go. Let's talk about secure application management from OWASP perspective. OWASP is the Open Web Application Security Project. They manage the top 10 security vulnerabilities for applications and also many other useful tools for analyzing applications, such as the Z-Attack proxy. We'll talk about Z-Attack proxy as well as continuous integration, continuous delivery. And we'll look at continuous deployment, as it sometimes is different in the sense that it's not they're not mutually exclusive. They do work together, but we're talking about getting code out the door more effectively and checking in several changes along the way. We'll talk about elasticity, scalability. We'll look at version control of software, object-oriented programming, as well as input validation and application security. Input validation being one of the critical strategies for stopping several different kinds of attacks. We'll talk about secure cookies, hypertext transfer protocol headers. We'll look at code signing certificates, allow and block lists or deny lists. Sometimes we'll talk about the implicit deny. We'll look at some other secure coding practices, static code analysis, and dynamic code analysis. We'll also talk about code review or code audits, as it's sometimes called. And we'll talk about fuzzing, sending random data at a target to see what kind of vulnerabilities might be revealed. You can fuzz protocols, you can fuzz applications, many different things. There's lots of fuzzing tools out there, some of them open source, some proprietary. Topic 16, we'll talk about biometrics. Biometrics is a critical component of authentication, as we know. So biometrics we will include fingerprint authentication. We'll talk about iris recognition, facial recognition, voice. And we'll look at some of the different modalities, as they're called, and similarities and differences between other authentication technologies. We'll talk about vein detection, gate detection, a couple of the parameters you want to be aware of: false acceptance rate and false rejection rate. Then in topic 17, we'll get into cryptography. Cryptography being the study of encryption. We'll go over a brief history of cryptography, some of the different goals. We'll talk about cryptographic keys, public and private. We'll talk about symmetric and asymmetric encryption. Talk about different standards like digital signature standard, message digest. We'll talk about block cipher versus stream ciphers. We'll look at some of the different block cipher modes. The block ciphers essentially just means that it's going to take the data to be encrypted and chop it up into little blocks of data, so they'll all be the same size. We'll look at different algorithms, symmetric and asymmetric encryption. We'll talk about public key infrastructure, PKI, as well as the famous RSA algorithm and how that ties into cryptography, asymmetric. We'll talk about Diffie-Hellman. Then we'll look at some of the symmetric algorithms, AES, Two-Fish, Blowfish, IDEA, and many others. Some of the other principles we'll talk about: Enigma. We'll look at Caesar cipher, substitution ciphers, Kirchhoff's principle. We'll look at logical operations, bitwise operations, and, or, nor, not, and XOR, which is common in encryption algorithms. Some Boolean mathematics, modulus functions, one-way functions, and nonce, a number used once. And finally, cryptographic keys, both ephemeral and permanent. The main goal is to never hard code your keys, which we'll talk about. Now moving on to module 18, working from home remotely. So we're going to talk about the importance of working from home and how COVID has changed many of the resources that are available, and we'll talk about what some companies are saying. We'll look at some of the challenges of working from home, connecting to insecure public Wi-Fi, the problem of cell phones and geolocation. We'll also talk about some of the tools, work from home tools, firewalls, antivirus, VPNs. We'll talk about private browsing versus using a VPN, mixing personal and company data. We'll talk about some other best practices for working remotely and which operating system should I choose. So which one should you choose for your home use, your smartphone, etc. We'll talk about Chromebooks, and smartphone security as a whole. Really, Apple and Android are the two main players in the market, and although both of them have vulnerabilities, Apple does a bit of a better job with security, but we'll see how that plays into it, and also some of the initiatives that Android has brought to help move mobile devices forward, whereas much of our computing today, except by IT professionals, is done via mobile devices rather than via traditional desktop computers. So we have to talk about those dangerous, malicious mobile apps that are constantly under threat. We're constantly under attack from mobile apps, and basically attackers can upload mobile apps to third-party app stores and malicious websites, and essentially users will click on them and download them because they're either unsuspecting or the app looks legitimate. So we'll talk about that. And topic 19, artificial intelligence and machine learning, two important topics. They are not the same thing, though some people often put them together. AI is the overall umbrella term. Machine learning falls underneath AI. So we'll talk about artificial intelligence versus machine learning. We'll first have to define what they are. We'll look at deep learning. We'll talk about natural language processing. We'll get into some of the different machine learning careers, AI careers that are out there. We'll talk about skills required to work with AI and machine learning. So if you're going to be a security engineer at Tesla and you have to worry about their smart car algorithm being updated so their AI can recognize different vehicles on the road and obstacles that might appear to make everything better. We'll talk about different neural networks. We'll talk about some security implications for machine learning. Of course, machine learning is helping security a lot, but there are some challenges as well. We'll talk about different security risks, supervised versus unsupervised learning, a couple of different methods. We'll talk about machine learning APIs, application program interfaces, by which we interact with the cloud. So topic number 20, blockchain. We're going to talk about what blockchain is, the history of Bitcoin, how Bitcoin came to be one of the dominant forces as far as cryptocurrency. We'll talk about Bitcoin versus the blockchain, what exactly a blockchain is. We'll go over the different ecosystem of Bitcoin, how some have tried to cut out the middleman and play the honest broker, even though it's a very speculative currency. We'll talk about building consensus, how there are many different cryptocurrencies out there, how blockchain works, and the uses of blockchain. So the last but not least topic, we have classful IP addressing, which we'll talk about what is an IP address. We'll go over the purpose of the Internet Protocol. We'll talk about subnet masking. We'll look at the bits that are required to mask an IP address. We'll talk about the default gateway, which you most likely would refer to your home router. In an enterprise setting, that's just whatever the last hop is before it leaves the enterprise. We'll talk about IP version 4 packet makeup versus IP version 6. We'll get into different implementations of IP version 6. We'll talk about dual stacking and all that. We'll look at converting from binary to decimal, decimal to binary. We'll talk about subnetting, classful versus classless IP addressing, and we'll talk about supernetting. So we've also covered a lot of the best practices for the course. Essentially, work hard, study hard, give it your best, dedicate the time, take the time away from family as needed, or integrate your family with it because it's important knowledge for them to know as well. Everything we do is connected. You only get out of it what you put into it. This course is your course. This is not my course as an instructor. This is not anybody else's courses but yours as a student. You're only going to get out of it what you put into it. If you work hard and you follow our model and you go over the cert tips and you do the practice questions and you apply yourself, you will absolutely be successful in navigating this course. Appreciate your attention. We covered the market need for cybersecurity engineers. We looked at our company. We talked about the exam. We went over the recommended experience level or prerequisites for the audience for the class. We talked about the different course topics, all 21 topics, and we covered those in little short snippets. And finally, best practices for the course. So I wish you all the success, and we'll see you inside the course. Thank you.